After losing everything in a brutal divorce, a broken veteran moved into a collapsing shack deep in the Montana mountains. But days later, his German shepherd started clawing at a wall. And what they uncovered had been hidden there for over 100 years. When Marcus Hale walked out of that courtroom, he owned almost nothing. 28 years of marriage were gone in a single afternoon. The only thing left to his name was a dilapidated shack buried deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Most people would have called it the end of a man's life. But Marcus wasn't completely alone. At his side was Titan, the German shepherd who had followed him through war, loss, and now into the wilderness. The shack was falling apart. The roof leaked. The walls creaked in the wind. But something about the place felt unfinished. And a few nights later, Titan started scratching at a wall. What Marcus discovered behind that wall would change his life forever. Before we begin this incredible story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The courtroom in Missoula felt colder than the Montana winter waiting outside. Marcus Hale stood near the defense table, shoulders squared the way they had been trained to stand decades earlier in military formation. Even now, at 63, the posture of a soldier had never left him. But today, the strength in that posture felt hollow. The room smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and old carpet. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence between the judge's words. Across the room sat Rebecca. 28 years of marriage separated them now like two distant continents. She didn't look at Marcus. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the man beside her, a sharply dressed real estate investor named Andrew Keller, whose watch probably cost more than Marcus's old pickup truck. Rebecca looked younger than she had in years. New haircut, new clothes, a confidence Marcus didn't remember from their life together. The judge adjusted his glasses and flipped the final page of the divorce decree. After reviewing the agreements submitted by both parties, he said calmly, "The court awards the primary residence, retirement accounts, and investment assets to Rebecca Hale." Marcus felt the words land like distant artillery. Not loud, but final. He didn't react. Years in special forces had taught him how to keep his face still when everything inside him wanted to break. The judge continued. "Mr. Hale will retain ownership of the inherited property located in Ravalli County, a small structure on 20 acres previously belonging to Mr. Hale's father." Rebecca's attorney spoke next, his voice smooth and casual. "The property has no utilities, no market development, and minimal assessed value. We believe this arrangement is fair." Fair. Marcus almost smiled at the word. He hadn't set foot on that land in nearly 20 years. His father had bought it after the Vietnam era, dreaming of building a hunting cabin. The project never happened. After his father died, Marcus had been deployed overseas, and the land had simply faded into memory. Now it was the only thing left. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "The divorce is finalized." The sound echoed across the room. Just like that, 30 years of a life together ended in less than 30 seconds. Marcus exhaled slowly. Beside his chair lay Titan. The large German shepherd had remained perfectly still through the entire hearing, trained to stay quiet unless commanded otherwise. His deep brown eyes never left Marcus. Titan had been Marcus's companion for nearly 9 years. Marcus found him during a training exercise overseas, an abandoned military dog scheduled to be euthanized after losing his handler. Marcus had refused to leave him behind. Since then, the dog had followed him everywhere. Now Titan rose to his feet and nudged Marcus's hand with his nose. A silent question. Marcus scratched behind Titan's ears. "I'm all right, buddy," he murmured under his breath. Across the aisle, Rebecca stood and gathered her purse. Andrew Keller placed a hand gently on the small of her back as if guiding her toward their new future. Marcus watched them for a moment. Rebecca finally glanced over. Her eyes moved across him quickly, like someone looking at a stranger in a grocery store. Then she spoke. "You'll like the cabin," she said with a small shrug. "It's peaceful out there." Her voice carried just enough sweetness to sound polite, but her smile carried none of it. Andrew chuckled softly beside her. Rebecca added, almost casually, "Honestly, Marcus, it's probably worth about as much as a pile of firewood." The words landed harder than the judge's gavel. Marcus said nothing. He had heard worse things in war zones, but those insults had come from enemies. These came from someone who once knew every scar on his body. Rebecca turned and walked toward the exit. Andrew followed her, already checking something on his phone. They didn't look back. Marcus stood there a few seconds longer. Titan pressed his head gently against Marcus's hand again. For a moment, Marcus closed his eyes. The sound of a helicopter blade thumping somewhere deep in his memory suddenly rose inside his head. A familiar echo from a different time. PTSD had a way of doing that. Certain sounds, certain stress, certain endings. The courtroom blurred for a second. Marcus inhaled slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A trick he had learned years ago when the war followed him home. The feeling passed. When he opened his eyes again, the courtroom had mostly emptied. Only the clerk remained, stacking papers. Marcus picked up the small folder containing the deed to the land in Ravalli County. 20 acres, one abandoned shack. That was his entire life now. Outside, the Montana air hit him like a clean slap across the face. Late autumn had already painted the mountains with cold blue shadows. The parking lot stretched wide beneath a pale sky. Rebecca and Andrew were standing beside a brand-new black SUV. Marcus saw Andrew open the passenger door for her. Rebecca laughed at something he said. The sound carried across the lot. Marcus didn't realize he had stopped walking until Titan stopped beside him too. Rebecca noticed him then. She hesitated for a moment. Then she called out across the pavement. "Well, good luck out there, Marcus." Andrew leaned against the SUV door, watching with mild amusement. Rebecca added one last line before getting in the car. "Try not to let the shack collapse on you." The SUV door shut, the engine started, and within seconds they were gone. Marcus stood alone in the parking lot. Cars passed. People walked by. No one noticed the tall, gray-haired man and his German shepherd standing quietly beside an old truck. Titan sat at Marcus's side and looked up at him. His ears twitched slightly. Waiting. Marcus finally exhaled. "Well," he said quietly. He looked down at the deed in his hand, then out toward the mountains visible beyond the city. "Looks like it's just you and me now." Titan wagged his tail once, slow and steady. Marcus scratched the dog's neck again and walked toward his truck. He didn't know it yet, but the shack Rebecca had mocked was about to change everything. And the one who would discover it first would not be Marcus. It would be Titan. The old pickup rumbled north along Highway 93, its engine carrying the tired growl of a machine that had seen too many winters. Marcus Hale kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the ribbon of road stretching toward the mountains. Beside him, Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the world pass by through the window. Missoula slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. Stores turned into scattered houses. Houses turned into open fields. And then the fields gave way to tall stands of pine trees climbing the slopes of the Bitterroot Range. The farther Marcus drove, the quieter the world became. It reminded him of long patrols overseas, the strange stillness that came when civilization fell behind and nature took over. Except this time, there were no radios crackling, no squad behind him. Just Marcus and Titan. The sky was pale gray, the kind of cold Montana sky that promised snow before long. Wind pushed dry leaves across the road in restless circles. Marcus glanced down at the folded deed sitting on the dashboard. 20 acres. An abandoned shack. That was everything he owned now. Titan shifted slightly, sensing the tension in Marcus's shoulders. The dog leaned forward and rested his head gently against Marcus's arm. Marcus scratched behind Titan's ears. "Yeah," he muttered softly. "Not exactly the retirement plan I imagined either." Titan's tail thumped once against the seat. They drove for nearly 2 hours before Marcus turned off the highway. The paved road narrowed into a gravel county road that wound between tall fir trees and rocky hillsides. Dust lifted behind the truck like a ghost following them. Another 20 minutes later, even the gravel disappeared. Now the truck crawled along a narrow dirt trail, barely wide enough for one vehicle. Branches scraped lightly along the sides of the truck. Pine needles carpeted the ground. Marcus slowed the truck to a crawl. "Must be close," he murmured. Titan sat forward, ears raised, nose twitching as unfamiliar wilderness scents drifted through the open window. Deer, cold river water, old wood, and something else. A smell Titan didn't recognize. Finally, the trees opened slightly, revealing a small clearing tucked against the lower slope of the mountains. Marcus eased the truck to a stop. For a long moment, he simply sat there. The shack stood about 50 yards away. Rebecca had called it firewood. Looking at it now, Marcus realized she had not been exaggerating. The building leaned slightly to one side, like an old man who had forgotten how to stand straight. The wooden boards had turned gray from decades of weather. One corner of the roof sagged inward, where snow must have collapsed it years ago. 2 windows were broken. The front porch had partially fallen apart. Vines crawled up the walls like slow-moving snakes reclaiming the structure. Titan tilted his head. Marcus let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly, "I've seen worse." That wasn't entirely true, but soldiers learned early that complaining never fixed anything. Marcus opened the truck door. Cold mountain air rushed in instantly, carrying the sharp scent of pine trees and distant snow. Titan jumped down first and immediately began surveying the clearing, nose low to the ground, circling slowly. Marcus stepped out and stretched his back. The silence hit him harder than he expected. No traffic, no neighbors, no city noise. Just wind moving through tall trees and the distant cry of a hawk somewhere above the valley. It was the kind of silence that most people found uncomfortable. Marcus found it familiar. He grabbed a small duffel bag from the truck bed and started toward the shack. The ground was uneven beneath his boots, scattered with rocks and pine cones. Titan moved ahead of him, scanning the area with alert focus. Halfway to the cabin, Titan stopped. His body stiffened. Marcus froze instantly. Years of training snapped back into place. Titan's ears pointed toward the trees. Low growl. Marcus slowly turned his head. At the edge of the clearing, something moved between the trunks. For a moment, Marcus saw nothing. Then the shape appeared. A large mule deer stepped cautiously from the shadows, staring at them with wide, dark eyes. Titan relaxed immediately. Marcus chuckled under his breath. "Stand down, soldier." Titan wagged his tail. The deer bounded away into the forest, disappearing almost instantly. Marcus approached the shack. Up close, the damage was even clearer. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The wood around the frame had cracked and warped with age. Moss grew along the lower boards where rainwater had soaked the structure year after year. Marcus placed a hand against the door. The wood felt soft. He pushed. The door groaned loudly before swinging open. A stale wave of cold, damp air rolled out from inside. Titan stepped forward carefully, nose working fast. Marcus followed. The interior was dark. Dust floated through thin beams of light coming through broken windows. The floorboards creaked beneath Marcus's boots. The cabin was a single open room. A stone fireplace sat against the far wall. A small kitchen counter leaned crookedly beside it. An old ladder led to a tiny loft that probably served as a sleeping area. Everything inside was coated with years of dust and debris. Animal tracks crisscrossed the floor. Raccoons, maybe. Or worse. Marcus slowly turned in place, taking it all in. His mind automatically started making a list. Roof repairs, new boards, clean the fireplace, seal the windows. A lot of work, but not impossible. Titan moved deeper into the cabin, sniffing along the walls. Marcus set his bag down and walked to the fireplace. He ran his fingers along the stone. Still solid. That was something. Wind pushed through the broken window behind him, making one loose board creak slowly against the wall. For a moment, the sound made Marcus's chest tighten. In his mind, it wasn't wind. It was rotor blades. Helicopters cutting through jungle air. Marcus closed his eyes. The memory came fast. Gunfire, radio chatter, men shouting. Marcus inhaled sharply and opened his eyes again. The shack returned around him. Dust, cold air, quiet forest. Titan walked back over and leaned against Marcus's leg, grounding him. Marcus rested a hand on the dog's back. "I know," he whispered. Titan looked up at him with steady brown eyes. No judgment, no pity, just loyalty. Marcus looked around the cabin again. It wasn't much, but it was his. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, Marcus felt something inside him shift. Not hope, not yet, but something close. A beginning. Outside, the wind moved through the pines again, and somewhere deep in the woods beyond the clearing, something watched them. Titan's ears twitched slightly toward the sound. Then he settled back beside Marcus. The dog didn't know it yet. But this broken cabin was hiding something. Something that had been waiting in silence for over a century. And Titan would be the one to find it. But that first night, Marcus Hale knew nothing about hidden secrets. All he knew was that the mountain cold moved quickly once the sun disappeared. By late afternoon, the sky over the Bitterroot Range had turned the color of steel. The wind slid through the pine trees with a low whisper that carried the smell of snow somewhere far above the ridgelines. Marcus stood outside the shack, hands on his hips, studying the roof. "Not perfect," he muttered, "but it'll hold for tonight." He had spent the last few hours doing what soldiers always did when dropped into unfamiliar territory. Assess, secure, adapt. Broken boards from the porch had been nailed loosely over the worst hole in the roof. A piece of plastic tarp from the truck covered the shattered window facing west. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep most of the wind out. Inside, Marcus had swept away years of dust and animal debris from a corner of the floor near the fireplace. Titan watched every move with patient attention. Now Marcus knelt beside the stone hearth. He stacked small twigs first, then thicker branches he had gathered from the clearing. The lighter flicked once, twice. The third spark caught. Within seconds, the small pile of dry pine crackled to life. Flames licked upward, casting warm orange light across the gray wooden walls. Marcus leaned back slightly and stretched his stiff shoulders. "Fire," he said quietly. Titan thumped his tail once. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Marcus opened a small can of beans from his duffel bag and placed it beside the fire to warm. The smell slowly filled the room. Outside, darkness settled across the mountains. By the time Marcus finished eating, the world beyond the shack had turned completely black. The forest was a different place at night. Wind moving through tall trees sounded like distant waves. Branches cracked somewhere far away. A lone owl called once, then fell silent. Marcus rolled out his old sleeping bag near the fire. Titan lay down beside him without needing to be told. For a while, Marcus simply stared at the flames. The flickering light danced across the walls of the shack, throwing long shadows that moved slowly, like ghosts from another century. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Marcus felt the old tension creeping up his spine. He recognized the feeling immediately. The war had been over for years, but the war inside his head never completely left. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the fire crackling in the hearth sounded different. Not wood. Gunfire. His breathing quickened. In his mind, the cold Montana air disappeared, replaced by thick jungle heat and the distant thumping roar of helicopter blades. Men shouting. Radio static. Marcus's hand tightened instinctively around the edge of his sleeping bag. His heart began to race. Then something warm pressed gently against his chest. Marcus opened his eyes. Titan was there. The dog had moved closer during Marcus's restless moment. His head rested firmly against Marcus's ribcage, steady and calm. Titan's breathing was slow, even, untroubled. Marcus placed a hand on the dog's neck. The solid warmth of Titan's body grounded him. The jungle faded. The shack returned. The fire cracked softly. Wind brushed against the outside walls. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You always know," he murmured. Titan lifted his head slightly, as if answering. Marcus scratched behind his ears. "Good soldier." They lay there together for a long time. Eventually, Marcus drifted into sleep. But sometime after midnight, Titan's head lifted suddenly. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward. A low growl vibrated quietly in his throat. Marcus woke instantly. Years of military instinct brought him upright before he fully understood why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin was dim and silent. Titan stood now, his body stiff, his nose pointed toward the door. Marcus listened. At first there was nothing. Then he heard it. Heavy footsteps in the snow-dusted leaves outside. Slow, deliberate. Something large moved through the clearing. Marcus rose quietly and stepped toward the window covered by the tarp. He lifted the edge slightly. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, and there it was, a massive black bear. The animal moved slowly across the open ground, sniffing the air. Marcus held still. Titan remained silent beside him, muscles tense but controlled. The bear paused only 20 yards from the shack. For a moment it stood on its hind legs, sniffing toward the cabin. Marcus could see the animal's breath forming white clouds in the cold night air. Then Titan gave one deep bark, sharp, confident. The bear dropped back down instantly. It stared toward the cabin for a few seconds. Then it turned and lumbered back toward the forest. Branches cracked as the animal disappeared into the darkness. Marcus let the tarp fall back into place. He looked down at Titan. "Well," he said softly, "guess we're not alone out here." Titan wagged his tail once, proud of his work. Marcus returned to his sleeping bag and lay back down beside the fading fire. Outside, the mountains settled once again into deep silence. But Marcus noticed something now. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, wild, honest. Titan curled beside him once more. Marcus stared up at the dark ceiling of the shack. Rebecca had imagined him alone out here, broken, forgotten. But as the fire's last glow faded and Titan's steady breathing filled the room, Marcus realized something important. He wasn't alone. Not really. The mountain had accepted him for the night, and Titan stood guard beside him like he always had. What Marcus didn't know yet was that somewhere inside the walls of this broken cabin, a secret from the gold rush era waited patiently, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right discovery, waiting for Titan. Morning came slowly to the Bitterroot Mountains. At first, it was only a faint gray light pushing through the cracks in the wooden walls. Then the cold air began to glow with pale blue dawn as the sun climbed somewhere behind the ridgeline. Marcus Hale opened his eyes before the light fully reached the cabin. Years in the military had trained his body to wake early, long before sunrise. Even now, after retirement and divorce and everything else that had fallen apart, that habit remained. For a moment, he didn't move. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. The second thing he noticed was Titan. The German shepherd was already awake, sitting upright near the door, like a sentry standing watch over a silent base camp. Marcus pushed himself up from the sleeping bag, joints stiff from the cold wooden floor. "Morning, soldier," he said softly. Titan turned immediately, tail wagging once in recognition. Marcus stood and stretched his back. Muscles complained in several places, but he ignored it. Pain was familiar. Outside the broken window, sunlight slowly touched the tops of the pine trees. The mountains were painted gold along their ridges, while the valley remained blue with early morning shadow. Marcus stepped outside. Cold air bit instantly against his face, but it was clean air. Mountain air. The kind that filled your lungs completely. He inhaled deeply. For the first time since leaving the courthouse in Missoula, Marcus felt something inside him settle. This place might be broken, but it wasn't fake. Titan trotted ahead into the clearing, sniffing the ground, circling the cabin as if conducting his own security sweep. Marcus watched him for a moment. "Perimeter check, huh?" Titan's ears flicked back briefly, as if acknowledging the comment. Marcus turned his attention to the shack. In the bright daylight, the structure looked even worse than it had the night before. The roof sagged heavily on the left side. 2 sections of the outer wall had begun to warp from years of rain and snow. The porch leaned dangerously forward. Marcus walked slowly around the building. His eyes moved carefully across every board, every corner. This was how soldiers studied terrain before setting up camp. Assess what you had, then figure out how to survive with it. Titan followed closely behind him now. Marcus crouched near the base of the cabin and ran his hand along the wood. Soft in places, rotten in others. But the support beams were still thick old pine logs. Solid. "Old man built this, right?" Marcus murmured, thinking of whoever had constructed the shack decades earlier. Titan suddenly stopped near the back wall. He sniffed carefully along the ground where damp moss covered the lower boards. Marcus noticed but said nothing. For now the dog was simply exploring. Marcus stood and looked toward the tree line. Tall pines surrounded the clearing like quiet guardians. Between them, he could see glimpses of distant mountain slopes rising toward snow-covered peaks. Somewhere nearby, he heard the faint sound of moving water. A stream. Marcus nodded to himself. Water source, he said. That was the first good sign. Survival always started with water. He grabbed an old metal canteen from his truck and started walking toward the sound. Titan followed immediately, moving slightly ahead on the narrow deer trail cutting through the brush. The trail dipped gently downhill. Within 2 minutes, the trees opened around a narrow mountain stream flowing over smooth gray stones. Clear water, cold enough to numb your fingers. Marcus knelt and filled the canteen. Titan stepped into the stream and drank eagerly. Marcus splashed water across his face and felt the chill cut through the last fog of sleep. When he stood again, he studied the area carefully. The stream curved around the back of the property before disappearing deeper into the forest. Good. Water meant life, and life meant possibility. They returned to the cabin together. Marcus rolled up his sleeves. Well, he said quietly, let's get to work. The first task was the roof. Marcus dragged several fallen branches from the edge of the clearing and used them to reinforce the weak section of the porch roof. Old nails from a rusted toolbox inside the shack helped secure the boards. The work was slow. Marcus hadn't done this kind of physical labor in years. His hands blistered quickly. His shoulders burned. But the rhythm of the work did something unexpected. It quieted the noise inside his mind. No helicopters, no gunfire, just hammer strikes and the wind in the trees. Titan stayed close the entire time. Sometimes he carried smaller sticks in his mouth and dropped them near Marcus, like a proud assistant bringing tools. Marcus chuckled. Not exactly military engineering, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. But we'll manage. By late afternoon, the cabin looked slightly less like a ruin. The broken porch rail had been removed. Loose boards were nailed back into place. The tarp over the window had been secured properly. Marcus stepped back and studied the result. Still rough, still ugly, but standing. Titan sat beside him, tongue hanging happily. Marcus reached down and scratched his neck. You know what, buddy? He said. Rebecca might have been right about one thing. Titan tilted his head. This place was supposed to be the end of the road for me. Marcus looked out across the quiet clearing. Sunlight streamed through the tall pines, turning the air golden with drifting dust and pine pollen. But I've survived worse places than this. Titan wagged his tail slowly. Marcus smiled faintly. Yeah, he said. We'll make it work. The sun dipped lower toward the mountains. Evening shadows stretched across the clearing. Marcus gathered more firewood and stacked it beside the cabin. Inside, the small fire crackled again as the temperature began to drop. Titan curled near the doorway, watching the forest beyond the clearing. Marcus sat near the hearth, tired but calmer than he had been in weeks. Outside, wind brushed softly through the trees. And somewhere beneath the aging boards of the shack, a hidden space waited patiently. A space no one had opened for more than 100 years. Titan lifted his head suddenly. His ears twitched. He looked toward the back wall of the cabin, but after a moment, he lay down again. The secret remained undisturbed. For now. Morning came quietly to the Bitterroot clearing. The kind of calm mountain morning that seemed almost too peaceful to trust. A thin layer of frost coated the grass outside the shack. When the first rays of sunlight slid between the tall pine trees, the frost sparkled like crushed glass across the ground. Marcus Hale stepped outside with a metal cup of coffee warming his hands. The coffee wasn't great. Instant powder mixed with boiled stream water. But after years of military rations, Marcus had learned not to complain about simple comforts. Titan followed him out onto the uneven porch. The German shepherd stretched, then shook his thick coat, sending tiny crystals of frost into the air. Marcus leaned against one of the porch posts and looked out across the clearing. It had been 4 days since they arrived. 4 days of hauling wood. 4 days of repairing boards. 4 days of silence. And strangely enough, Marcus was beginning to feel stronger. His hands were rough again, his shoulders sore in the familiar way that came from honest work. Even his breathing felt deeper in the cold mountain air. He sipped the coffee. "Not bad," he said to Titan. Titan sat beside him, scanning the edge of the forest like a watchful guard. The dog had settled into the routine quickly. Morning patrol, water from the stream, watching the trees. Marcus smiled slightly. "You take this job pretty seriously." Titan flicked an ear. Marcus finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch rail. "All right," he said. "Let's keep working." Today's task was the back wall of the shack. That section had taken the worst of the weather over the years. The boards were warped and dark with old moisture. Marcus grabbed a hammer and a pry bar from the toolbox inside the truck. Titan followed him around the side of the cabin. The forest felt closer back there. Tall trees leaned overhead, their branches forming a quiet green canopy. Moss covered the ground in soft patches. Marcus examined the wall carefully. "Yep," he muttered. "This section's not going to last another winter." He wedged the pry bar beneath the edge of a loose board. The wood cracked softly as he pulled it free. Titan watched from a few feet away. Marcus removed another board, then another. Each one revealed the older structure beneath. Thick, vertical beams. Hand-cut timber. Someone had built this place a long time ago, back when cabins were meant to survive harsh winters and rough men. Marcus paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. Then he heard it. Scratch. Marcus froze. Titan's ears snapped forward. Scratch. Scratch. The sound came from behind them. Marcus turned slowly. Titan stood near the back corner of the shack, his nose pressed tightly against the wall. The dog scratched at the wood again. Scratch. Marcus frowned. "What is it?" Titan scratched harder. The sound of his claws tapping against the board echoed slightly. Strangely. Marcus stepped closer. Titan moved aside but kept staring at the same spot. Marcus knocked lightly on the board. Thud. Solid. He knocked a few inches to the right. Thud. Still solid. Then he knocked exactly where Titan had scratched. The sound changed instantly. Hollow. Marcus stopped. He knocked again. Hollow. Titan's tail began wagging. Marcus stepped back slightly, studying the wall. The boards looked normal, but the sound told a different story. "Hold on," Marcus murmured. He slid the pry bar carefully between the seams of the plank Titan had been scratching. The wood resisted for a moment. Then it cracked loose with a dry snap. Marcus pulled the board free. Behind it was darkness. Not the inside of the cabin wall. A gap. Marcus leaned closer. Titan moved beside him immediately, nose twitching. Marcus reached into the opening and pulled another board away. The gap widened. Cold air drifted out from inside the wall. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his belt and shined the beam into the space. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his heart skipped. There was a cavity inside the wall, a hidden compartment, about 2 feet deep, 3 feet tall, and sitting at the bottom of it was a rusted metal chest. Marcus stared silently. Titan barked once, sharp and excited. Marcus knelt slowly. Well, I'll be damned. The chest was old, very old. Iron corners, heavy latch, the metal surface covered in a thick coat of rust and dust. Marcus carefully reached into the cavity. The chest was heavier than he expected. "Help me out here, Titan." Of course, Titan couldn't actually lift it, but he stood beside Marcus as if supervising the operation. Marcus gripped the sides and dragged the chest out onto the floor of the shack. It landed with a dull thud. Dust rose into the sunlight. Marcus sat back on his heels, breathing slowly. Titan sniffed the box eagerly. Marcus studied the latch. It had long since rusted loose. The chest had probably not been opened in decades, maybe longer. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans. "Well, buddy," he said quietly. "Looks like you found something." Titan wagged his tail proudly. Marcus lifted the lid. For a moment, the hinges groaned loudly. Then the chest opened. Inside were several tightly wrapped bundles of oilcloth. Marcus carefully lifted the first one out. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside were old documents. Very old. Yellowed paper. Handwritten notes. Maps. Marcus unfolded one of the maps. His eyes moved across the faded ink. And suddenly, his breathing stopped. Because printed across the center of the map were 3 words. Silver Claim Survey. Marcus looked at Titan. Titan tilted his head. Marcus let out a slow breath. Rebecca called this place Firewood. He looked back down at the map, then toward the mountains rising beyond the clearing. But I think she might have been wrong. Titan wagged his tail again. And outside the shack, the Bitterroot Mountains stood silent, as if they had been waiting a very long time for someone to discover what was hidden beneath them. Marcus Hale remained kneeling on the rough wooden floor of the shack, the old metal chest open in front of him. Dust drifted through the thin beams of afternoon sunlight, slipping through the patched window. Outside, the wind stirred the tops of the pine trees with a slow whisper. Inside the cabin, everything felt suddenly different. Titan stood beside him, tail wagging with quiet excitement, his nose hovering over the scattered papers as if he knew they mattered. Marcus carefully lifted another bundle from the chest. The cloth wrapping was stiff with age. When he unrolled it, more documents appeared. Maps, survey papers, and handwritten pages that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than an abandoned mountain shack. One sheet carried a date printed clearly across the top. Marcus leaned closer. The handwriting was neat but faded, written with ink that had browned over time. The name signed at the bottom read, Samuel R. Whitaker. Marcus flipped through several pages slowly. The papers described land measurements, geological notes, and something else that made Marcus's pulse begin to rise. Repeated references to silver deposits. Silver claim, Marcus murmured quietly. Titan let out a soft huff, as if agreeing. Marcus spread the map out across the floor. It was hand-drawn but detailed. Mountains, streams, and elevation lines were sketched with careful precision. A red circle had been drawn near the center of the page. Marcus leaned closer to read the faded note beside the circle. Primary vein located beneath ridge. Marcus's mind began to race. His father had owned this property, but his father had never mentioned a mine. Marcus remembered the man clearly. Quiet, stubborn, a former mechanic who preferred fixing engines to telling stories. After retiring, he had purchased this land with vague dreams of building a hunting cabin. But Marcus had been deployed overseas at the time. Then his father passed away unexpectedly. The land had simply transferred to Marcus, along with a stack of paperwork he barely glanced at before returning to duty. And now, Marcus ran a hand slowly through his hair. "Titan," he said quietly. The dog looked up immediately. "You might have just found something big." Titan's tail wagged harder. Marcus continued digging through the chest. Inside were small cloth bags filled with rock samples. The stones glittered faintly when Marcus turned them in the sunlight. Silver ore. Even with limited mining knowledge, Marcus recognized the metallic sheen. There were also letters. Old letters between Whitaker and someone named Daniel Boone Carter, likely an early investor. Marcus read one line slowly. Initial samples confirm high-grade silver vein beneath the eastern ridge. Development delayed due to financial collapse following the Panic of 1884. Marcus leaned back slightly. The Panic of 1884. A financial crisis that had shut down banks and halted countless projects during the old mining days. If this Whitaker had discovered silver here but lost funding, then the mine had never been opened. Marcus looked around the shack. This building might have been constructed as a temporary mining camp, a base for a project that never happened. Titan sat beside him now, head tilted curiously at the papers spread across the floor. Marcus rubbed the dog's neck. "Guess you weren't just scratching at the wall for fun." Titan wagged his tail proudly. Marcus stood and walked slowly to the doorway of the shack. The clearing stretched peacefully in front of him. Tall grass moved softly in the wind. The forest beyond looked untouched, ancient, and quiet. Somewhere out there, beneath the soil and stone, a silver vein might still be waiting. Marcus folded the map carefully and carried it outside. Titan followed instantly. They walked to the edge of the clearing where the ground began to slope upward toward a rocky ridge. Marcus compared the map to the land, the stream, the tree line, the shape of the hillside. Slowly, the map began to match the terrain around him. Then he saw it. About 200 yards away, the ridge rose sharply where the forest thinned into exposed rock. Marcus pointed. "Right there." Titan barked once. Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah, that's what the map says, too." They walked partway toward the ridge before Marcus stopped. He wasn't rushing this. Years of military training had taught him something valuable. When you find something important, you slow down, you think, you plan. Marcus turned back toward the shack. He needed information. He needed confirmation. And he needed someone who understood geology better than a retired soldier. Marcus scratched Titan behind the ears again. "Looks like we're taking a trip to town tomorrow." Titan wagged his tail. Marcus glanced back once more toward the ridge. The mountains stood silent, their slopes glowing under the fading afternoon sun. Somewhere beneath that rock, Silver might still be sleeping. And thanks to a loyal German shepherd scratching at an old cabin wall, Marcus Hale had just found the first clue. The first real sign that the life Rebecca thought she had destroyed might not be over at all. That night, Marcus slept lightly. Not because of nightmares, but because his mind would not slow down. The old map lay spread across the small table inside the shack, weighed down by a wrench and a metal mug so the curling edges wouldn't fold back over themselves. Marcus sat beside it long after the fire had burned low. Titan lay near the doorway, occasionally lifting his head when the wind moved through the trees. Marcus studied the faded red circle on the map again and again. Primary vein beneath ridge. If Whitaker had been right, if the ore samples in the chest were real, then the land Rebecca had laughed about in the courthouse might be sitting on something far more valuable than anyone realized. Marcus leaned back slowly in the chair. He had learned one thing in the army. Hope was powerful. But hope without verification could get you killed. He needed proof. Real proof. The next morning, the sky over the Bitterroot Range was clear and bright. Cold air carried the smell of pine and damp soil. Marcus loaded the documents carefully into a weathered canvas folder. Titan watched every movement with alert curiosity. "You ready for a road trip?" Marcus asked. Titan's ears lifted instantly. Marcus smiled. "Thought so." The old pickup truck groaned to life after 2 attempts. Marcus steered down the narrow dirt road leading away from the clearing. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, his head high, eyes scanning the passing forest like a co-pilot on patrol. The drive to Hamilton took nearly 40 minutes. The road wound through steep hillsides, crossed narrow wooden bridges, and eventually opened into a quiet valley town that looked as if it hadn't changed much in 30 years. A small diner, a gas station, a hardware store, and a modest brick building with a sign that read, "Brooks Geological Services." Marcus parked the truck. Titan jumped out beside him. Inside the office, shelves were lined with rock samples, maps, and surveying equipment. The smell of paper, dust, and machine oil filled the room. A man in his mid-40s looked up from behind a desk. He wore glasses and a worn flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled halfway up his arms. "Morning," the man said. Marcus nodded. "Morning." The man glanced at Titan. "Friendly?" Marcus scratched Titan's neck. "He's friendlier than he looks." The man smiled slightly. "Name's Ethan Brooks." Marcus extended his hand. "Marcus Hale." "What can I help you with?" Marcus set the canvas folder on the desk and opened it. "Found these inside an old cabin wall." Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Marcus spread the map across the desk. Ethan leaned forward. At first he studied it casually, then his expression slowly changed. He adjusted his glasses and leaned even closer. "Where did you say you found this?" "Cabin in the Bitterroot foothills," Marcus replied. "About 10 miles west of town." Ethan picked up one of the ore samples Marcus had brought. He held it under the desk lamp, turning it carefully. The metallic glint in the rock caught the light. Ethan's voice became quieter. "You mind if I run a quick test?" Marcus nodded. "Go ahead." Ethan disappeared into a small lab room behind the office. Marcus waited. Titan sat patiently beside him, his head resting against Marcus's leg. 5 minutes passed. 10. Marcus listened to the faint sounds of equipment humming and metal tools clicking. Then Ethan returned. The man's expression had changed completely. "What did you say your name was again?" Ethan asked. "Marcus Hale." Ethan set the rock sample back on the desk. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "this isn't just silver ore." Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan tapped the rock. "This is high-grade silver ore." Marcus said nothing. Ethan pointed to the map again. "If this survey is accurate, and if the vein runs where this old prospector marked it—" He paused. Then he finished the sentence slowly. "You could be sitting on a very significant deposit." Marcus felt the air in the room change. "How significant?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Hard to say without a full geological survey. But judging by this sample," he looked at Marcus, "this could be worth millions." Marcus stared at the map. Millions. Just days ago, he had been standing in a courtroom being handed what everyone believed was worthless land. Titan nudged Marcus's hand gently. Marcus looked down at the dog. "You hear that?" he said quietly. Titan wagged his tail. Ethan folded the map carefully. "You need to understand something," he said. "Once word of this gets out, companies will come knocking. Mining firms, investors, lawyers. Marcus nodded slowly. I figured. Ethan studied him for a moment. So what are you planning to do? Marcus looked out the office window. Across the street, a pickup truck drove slowly past the diner. People moved casually along the sidewalk. Normal life. Simple life. Then he looked back at Ethan. For now, Marcus said, I'm going back to the ridge. Ethan blinked. To start digging? Marcus shook his head. No, he smiled slightly. To make sure the mountain agrees with your test. Titan barked once, tail wagging. Ethan laughed. Well, he said, if you do find that vein, you might want to call me. Marcus folded the map and placed it back into the folder. I will. Outside, the sunlight had grown warmer as midday approached. Marcus climbed back into the truck. Titan settled into the passenger seat again. As they drove away from Hamilton, Marcus glanced toward the mountains rising in the distance. The ridge waited quietly beneath the blue sky. But now, Marcus knew something the rest of the world didn't. Beneath that stone, a forgotten fortune might still be sleeping. Marcus Hale drove slowly up the narrow dirt road toward the clearing as the afternoon sun slid behind the high ridges of the Bitterroot Mountains. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Tall pine trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering overhead like distant voices. The sky above them was a deep blue, and the air carried that clean mountain scent Marcus had already begun to recognize as home. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, alert as always. When the shack finally came into view between the trees, Titan's tail thumped softly against the seat. Marcus parked the truck and stepped out. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the ridge in the distance. The same ridge marked on the old map. The same ridge where Whitaker had written those words over a century ago. Primary vein beneath ridge. Marcus exhaled slowly. All right, he murmured. Titan barked once. Marcus grabbed a small backpack from the truck. Inside he packed a flashlight, rope, a first aid kit, and the old map folded carefully in plastic. Years of military habit never left a man. You didn't explore unknown terrain unprepared. Titan waited by the edge of the clearing, muscles tense with excitement. Stay close, Marcus said. Titan wagged his tail and immediately fell into step beside him. They walked toward the ridge. The ground sloped upward gradually, covered with moss and fallen needles. Sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden beams. Marcus studied the map again as they climbed. According to Whitaker's notes, the silver vein ran along the eastern side of the ridge where exposed rock broke through the forest floor. It took them 15 minutes to reach the base. Here the trees thinned. Gray stone jutted out of the hillside in jagged layers. Marcus ran his hand along the rock. Cold, rough, ancient. Titan sniffed along the ground, moving slowly from one patch of earth to another. Marcus pulled a small rock hammer from his pack and tapped gently against one of the exposed stones. Clink. The sound echoed faintly. He chipped away a small piece and examined it in the sunlight. At first it looked like ordinary granite. Then a thin silver line flashed inside the rock. Marcus's heart began to pound. He chipped another piece, then another. The metallic shine appeared again, not everywhere, but enough. Marcus sat back on the rock and stared at the hillside. Ethan had been right. There was silver here. Real silver. Titan barked happily and trotted farther along the ridge. Marcus stood and followed. But as they moved along the slope, the terrain grew steeper. Loose stones shifted beneath Marcus's boots. Small cliffs rose between patches of forest. The ridge was not as gentle as it looked from below. Marcus slowed his pace. Easy, he muttered. Titan climbed ahead with the effortless balance only dogs seem to have on rough terrain. Marcus stepped carefully over a cluster of loose rocks. Then suddenly, the ground moved. A section of gravel beneath his foot slid sideways. Marcus lost his balance. His boot slipped off the edge of the rock shelf. In an instant, the world tilted. Marcus fell. The slope dropped sharply beneath him, sending him sliding down loose gravel and broken stone. Damn! He tried to grab something, anything, but the rocks shifted under his hands. Titan barked sharply above him. Marcus slammed into a larger boulder halfway down the slope. Pain exploded through his side. He gasped, clinging to the rock as loose gravel continued to slide past him into the narrow ravine below. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Above him, Titan barked again, louder now. Marcus looked up. The German shepherd raced down the slope toward him without hesitation. "Stay back!" Marcus shouted. But Titan ignored the command. The dog reached him and immediately grabbed the sleeve of Marcus's jacket with his teeth. Marcus stared in disbelief. "Titan!" The dog braced his legs against the rocks and pulled. Marcus tried to shift his weight upward. The slope beneath him crumbled again. More stones tumbled into the ravine. Titan growled softly, pulling harder. Marcus reached for a nearby root sticking from the hillside and grabbed it tightly. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself upward. Titan never let go. The climb back to stable ground took several painful minutes. Finally, Marcus rolled onto a patch of solid earth near the ridge. He lay there, breathing heavily. Titan stood beside him, panting, tail wagging weakly. Marcus pushed himself up slowly. His side ached sharply, but nothing felt broken. Then he noticed Titan. The dog was limping. Marcus frowned. "Titan?" He gently lifted the dog's front paw. A thin cut ran along the pad where a sharp stone had sliced through the skin during the climb. Not deep, but bleeding. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "You idiot," he whispered softly. Titan wagged his tail anyway. Marcus sat down and pulled the first aid kit from his pack. He cleaned the wound carefully and wrapped it with a small bandage. Titan sat still through the entire process, eyes locked on Marcus. When it was finished, Marcus rested his hand on the dog's head. "You didn't even think about it, did you?" Titan leaned against him. Marcus looked back toward the slope he had fallen down. Another few seconds. Another few feet. And that ravine might have ended very differently. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Looks like I still owe you one," he said quietly. Titan wagged his tail again. The sun was already dipping lower behind the mountains. Marcus stood carefully. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home." They walked slowly back down the ridge toward the shack. Marcus moved more carefully now. Titan limped slightly, but refused to fall behind. When the clearing finally came into view through the trees, the sky had turned orange with evening light. Marcus stopped once more and looked back at the ridge. Somewhere up there, the silver vein waited beneath the rock. But the mountain had already given him a warning. This wasn't going to be easy. Marcus rested his hand on Titan's neck. "Guess we're doing this together," he said. Titan gave a soft bark. And for the first time since the courthouse in Missoula, Marcus didn't feel alone anymore. The days that followed felt different. Not easier, but clearer. Marcus woke each morning before sunrise, the same way he had for most of his life. The mountains were quiet at that hour. The sky still pale and cold before the sun crested the Bitterroot Ridge. Titan usually woke first. Even with the bandage around his paw, the German shepherd insisted on making his morning patrol around the clearing. Marcus would watch him through the doorway of the shack, a dark silhouette moving carefully through the early mist. The injury slowed Titan slightly, but it didn't change his determination. Marcus admired that. He understood it. Pain was simply another obstacle, something to move through, something to outlast. Marcus spent his mornings studying the ridge and the maps from Whitaker's chest. The old prospector had left surprisingly detailed notes, angles of rock formations, measurements of distance from the stream, even small symbols marking where the richest ore samples had been found. Marcus copied everything into a notebook. Old soldier habits again. Observe, record, adapt. After several days, Marcus began exploring the ridge again. This time, carefully marking locations with small red flags he bought from the hardware store in Hamilton. Titan followed every step. Sometimes the dog would stop suddenly and sniff the ground where Marcus had already examined the rock, as if confirming the discovery himself. One afternoon, Marcus struck a section of exposed stone with his hammer. The rock split cleanly. Inside, thin streaks of silver glimmered in the sunlight. Marcus smiled quietly. They were getting closer. By the end of the month, Marcus had dug several small test trenches along the ridge. Nothing large enough to be called a mine yet, but enough evidence to confirm the vein was real. Ethan Brooks visited twice during that time. The geologist walked the ridge with Marcus, occasionally kneeling to examine rock samples with a magnifying lens. Each visit made Ethan more convinced. "This vein runs deeper than I expected," he said during one survey. Marcus wiped dirt from his hands. "How deep?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "Deep enough that if it's consistent, it could support a small mining operation." Marcus looked down the slope toward the shack. A few weeks earlier, that place had felt like the end of his life. Now it looked like the beginning of something else. Word started to travel. Small towns had a way of sharing information quickly, even when people tried not to talk. Marcus noticed new trucks occasionally driving past the dirt road near the property. Sometimes, strangers stopped at the diner in Hamilton and asked questions about the old cabin in the mountains. Ethan warned him about that. "When people smell money," the geologist said one evening, "they start paying attention." Marcus understood that perfectly. For now, he continued working quietly, digging, mapping, learning, and healing. Titan's paw eventually recovered, though a thin scar remained along the pad. Marcus joked that the dog had earned his first official mining injury. Titan didn't seem to mind. But one morning, nearly a year after Marcus had first arrived at the shack, everything changed. Marcus had just returned from checking one of the trenches when he noticed a truck parked near the entrance to the clearing. A black SUV. New. Expensive. Marcus stopped walking. Titan immediately stiffened beside him. Two people stepped out of the vehicle. The first was a tall man in a tailored coat. The second, Marcus felt his chest tighten. Rebecca. Even from a distance, he recognized the way she stood. Confident, composed, as if she belonged wherever she happened to be. Her hair moved lightly in the mountain breeze. The man beside her was younger, probably the investor Marcus had heard about during the divorce. Rebecca spotted Marcus almost immediately. Her eyes moved from him to the shack to the equipment scattered near the ridge. Then she saw Titan. The German shepherd stood tall beside Marcus, ears forward. Rebecca smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile people wore when they believed they had already won. Marcus walked slowly toward them. Titan stayed at his side. The younger man spoke first. "Marcus Hale?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "That's me." The man extended a hand. Daniel Pierce. My wife and I wanted to speak with you. Marcus did not take the hand. Rebecca folded her arms casually. Hello, Marcus. Marcus studied her face. It had been nearly 2 years since the divorce. 2 years since she had stood in that courtroom and laughed about the worthless shack in the mountains. Now she was standing on the same land. Rebecca gestured toward the ridge. I heard some interesting things in town, she said. Marcus remained silent. Rebecca's smile widened slightly. Apparently, she continued, the property you received in the settlement has become quite valuable. Titan let out a low growl. Rebecca glanced down at the dog briefly. Still keeping that animal with you, I see. Marcus placed a hand gently on Titan's neck. The dog quieted instantly. Daniel Pierce cleared his throat. There may have been a misunderstanding during the divorce settlement, he said carefully. The land in question was originally part of a shared marital asset. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. So? Rebecca stepped forward. So, she said smoothly, our lawyer believes we're entitled to a portion of whatever profits you're planning to make from this mining operation. The clearing fell silent. Wind moved softly through the trees. Marcus looked at the shack, the ridge, the trenches he had dug with his own hands. Then he looked back at Rebecca. For a moment, he said nothing. Titan stood beside him like a stone statue. Finally, Marcus spoke. You laughed about this place, he said quietly. Rebecca's expression barely changed. Marcus continued. You said it wasn't worth more than a pile of firewood. Rebecca shrugged slightly. People make mistakes. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. They do. Rebecca tilted her head. So let's be practical about this, Marcus. Marcus looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time since the divorce, Rebecca saw something she hadn't expected. Marcus wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't defeated. He was calm, and calm men were difficult to control. Marcus rested his hand on Titan's back. You should probably leave, he said. Rebecca blinked. Daniel Pierce frowned. This conversation isn't finished, the man said. Marcus's voice remained steady. It is on my land. Titan's low growl returned. Rebecca studied Marcus for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the SUV. But before climbing inside, she looked over her shoulder. We'll be speaking again, she said. The vehicle disappeared down the dirt road a few minutes later. Marcus stood silently in the clearing. Titan looked up at him. Marcus exhaled slowly. The mountain wind moved through the trees, and somewhere deep beneath the ridge, the silver vein waited. But now Marcus understood something clearly. The real fight was only beginning. The dust from Rebecca's SUV hadn't even fully settled on the dirt road when the quiet returned to the clearing. Marcus stood still for a long moment, staring down the empty trail where the vehicle had disappeared between the pines. Titan remained beside him, muscles tense, ears alert. The dog understood conflict. He had sensed it the moment Rebecca stepped out of the car. Marcus slowly exhaled. Then he crouched beside Titan and scratched the dog behind the ears. Looks like we stirred up more than silver, he said quietly. Titan's tail wagged once. Marcus walked back toward the shack. The evening sun had dropped low behind the Bitterroot ridges, painting the entire valley with a deep orange glow. The mountains looked peaceful again, but Marcus knew better. He had spent enough years in combat to recognize the moment when calm shifted into confrontation. Rebecca wouldn't give up. Not now. Not after hearing about the mine. Inside the shack, Marcus poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the small wooden table. The old map from Whitaker lay open in front of him. For nearly a year he had been digging, mapping, and confirming what the old prospector had discovered more than a century earlier. The silver vein was real. Small-scale extraction had already begun. Marcus had hauled several buckets of ore down to Hamilton, where a refinery paid modest but encouraging sums. Nothing life-changing yet, but enough to prove the future. Now that future was under threat. Marcus leaned back slowly. Across the room, Titan lay near the door, watching the forest through the opening, like a sentry guarding a quiet outpost. Marcus studied the dog. "You know what's funny?" he said softly. Titan lifted his head. "When Rebecca left, I thought the fight was over." The fire crackled quietly in the stove. Marcus continued. "Turns out, I was just on the wrong battlefield." Titan thumped his tail lightly against the floor. Marcus smiled faintly. The next morning, he drove back into Hamilton. The town looked the same as always. The diner served the same coffee. The gas station had the same rusty sign swinging in the wind. But this time, Marcus noticed something new. People were watching him. Not suspiciously, curiously. News had clearly spread. Marcus walked straight into Brooks Geological Services. Ethan Brooks looked up from behind his desk. "Morning, Marcus." "Morning." Ethan studied his face for a moment. "Something happened." Marcus nodded. "My ex-wife showed up." Ethan leaned back in his chair slowly. "That didn't take long." Marcus sat down and folded his arms. "She's bringing lawyers." Ethan sighed. "Of course she is." Marcus placed a stack of documents on the desk, copies of the divorce settlement and land transfer paperwork. "I want to make sure everything is airtight." Ethan read through the papers carefully. Several minutes passed. Finally, he set them down. "Well," he said, "from what I can see, the land was legally transferred to you during the divorce settlement." Marcus nodded. "That's what the judge ruled," Ethan shrugged. "Then they don't have much ground to stand on." Marcus wasn't convinced. "They have money." Ethan smiled slightly. "Money helps." He tapped the documents. "But paperwork helps more." Marcus leaned forward. "I'm not selling the land." Ethan nodded. "I didn't think you would." Marcus looked out the office window toward the mountains. "Not after everything it took to get here." Ethan followed his gaze. "You planning to expand the mine?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan smiled. "Then you're going to need help." Over the next several weeks, Marcus began building something he never expected to create. A small operation. Local workers from Hamilton joined him, men who knew the mountains and respected the land. They built safer trenches along the ridge, installed basic extraction equipment, reinforced the old access paths. Marcus refused offers from large mining corporations that began calling after rumors of the silver deposit reached further towns. He didn't want investors controlling the land. He wanted control. And he wanted fairness. The men who worked with him were paid well. Safer methods were used. The operation grew slowly. Titan remained at Marcus's side through it all. The German Shepherd had become something of a legend among the workers. "The dog that found the mine," people joked. Titan didn't seem to mind the reputation. One afternoon, several months later, Marcus stood near the ridge, watching the workers load a small truck with ore samples. The sun was bright. The forest stretched endlessly around them. Titan lay nearby in the shade. Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Then a familiar black SUV appeared again at the entrance to the clearing. Marcus saw it instantly. Titan stood up at the same moment, Rebecca stepped out of the vehicle. This time, she wasn't smiling. Daniel Pierce stood beside her again, and behind them came a third man carrying a leather briefcase. The lawyer. Marcus walked down from the ridge slowly. The workers paused their activity. Titan walked beside Marcus like a silent guard. Rebecca spoke first. "You've been busy." Marcus looked past her toward the mountains. "Yeah." The lawyer opened his briefcase. "We're here to present a legal claim regarding the mineral rights associated with this property." Marcus listened calmly. Rebecca folded her arms. "You didn't think we'd just walk away, did you?" Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to the lawyer. The man read it carefully. His expression slowly changed. Rebecca frowned. "What is it?" The lawyer looked up. "This document confirms that the mineral rights were included in the land transfer during the divorce settlement." Rebecca blinked. "That's impossible." The lawyer shook his head slowly. "No." He looked directly at her. "It's very possible." Silence fell over the clearing. Rebecca stared at Marcus. Marcus remained calm. Behind him, the workers continued loading ore quietly. Titan sat beside Marcus, watching every movement. Rebecca's voice lowered. "You think this is over?" Marcus met her gaze. "It was over the day you signed the papers." The wind moved through the trees. Rebecca turned sharply and walked back to the SUV. Daniel Pierce followed. The lawyer hesitated briefly before joining them. The vehicle drove away again. This time, without promises. Marcus watched until it disappeared completely. Then he looked back toward the ridge. The silver vein still waited beneath the rock. The workers returned to their tasks. Titan nudged Marcus's hand. Marcus scratched the dog's neck. "Guess we keep digging," he said. And this time, the mountain belonged to him. 3 years passed in a way Marcus Hale never expected. Not quickly, not slowly, but steadily. Like the rhythm of a hammer striking rock, the Bitterroot clearing that had once held only a broken shack and a wounded man slowly transformed into something alive. The ridge above the property now held a modest but well-organized mining operation. Nothing like the massive industrial mines Marcus had seen on television. This one was different. It was careful, controlled, respectful of the mountain that had hidden its secret for more than a century. Small machinery hummed along the hillside. Wooden walkways connected the trenches where workers carefully extracted ore from the exposed silver vein. Marcus refused to turn the land into something reckless. He remembered too well how fragile peace could be. So the operation grew slowly. Local men from Hamilton worked the site. Loggers, mechanics, ranch hands, and a few former soldiers who had drifted through the town looking for work and purpose. Marcus hired them all. Not because they needed him, but because he understood what it meant to feel lost. Each morning began the same way. The sun rose over the Bitterroot peaks, turning the forest gold. Marcus stepped out onto the porch of a new log cabin that now stood beside the old shack. The original shack remained untouched. Marcus refused to tear it down. It was where everything had started. The place Rebecca had laughed at. The place Titan had scratched at the wall and uncovered Whitaker's forgotten chest. Now the small building stood like a quiet monument beside the larger home Marcus had built himself with help from the crew. Titan lay on the porch as always. The German shepherd was older now. Gray hairs had begun appearing around his muzzle, and the scar along his paw from the ridge accident had left a slight limp. But his eyes were still sharp, still loyal, still watching everything. Marcus stepped onto the porch and poured a cup of coffee from the thermos beside the door. The morning air smelled of pine and cold mountain stone. Below the ridge, several workers were already arriving at the site. Pickup trucks rolled slowly along the dirt road. Engines started. Tools clanked. Marcus watched quietly. Years ago, after the divorce, he had believed his life was finished. Now the land supported more than a dozen families in the valley. The mine provided steady work, fair pay, and something even more valuable: pride. Titan stood slowly and walked beside Marcus to the edge of the porch. Marcus scratched behind the dog's ears. "You still running security?" he asked. Titan wagged his tail gently. Several of the workers waved as they walked past. "Morning, Marcus." "Morning," Marcus nodded back. Among the men was a former Marine named Caleb, who had arrived in Hamilton 2 winters earlier with nowhere to go. Another was a quiet rancher named Walter, who had lost his property during a drought. Marcus didn't ask too many questions. He simply offered work, the way someone had once offered him a chance. Later that afternoon, a small group of vehicles drove up the road toward the clearing. Not lawyers, not investors. This time, it was something different. 3 pickup trucks carrying several men and women stepped out slowly. They moved with the careful posture Marcus recognized immediately. Veterans. One of them approached Marcus and extended a hand. "Name's David Torres," the man said. "Army." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "Marcus Hale." David glanced toward the ridge where the mine operated. "Ethan Brooks told us about you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The geologist?" David nodded. "He said you run a place where veterans can work if they need a fresh start." Marcus looked toward Titan. The dog sat calmly beside him. Marcus shrugged slightly. "Didn't think it was that official." David smiled. "Well, it is now." Over the next year, more veterans arrived. Some stayed only a few months. Some stayed permanently. Marcus built additional cabins near the forest edge so they had places to live while they worked. The mine continued producing steady silver. Not enormous wealth, but enough to support the small community forming around it. And every evening, when the work ended, the clearing filled with quiet conversation. Men who once carried invisible battles began learning how to breathe again. Titan wandered among them like an old sergeant inspecting his troops. Most evenings he eventually returned to the porch where Marcus sat watching the sun sink behind the Bitterroot Mountains. One autumn evening, Marcus sat beside Titan with a blanket draped across his shoulders. The air had grown colder. The first snow would arrive soon. Titan rested his head against Marcus's knee. Marcus looked across the clearing. The lights from the cabins glowed warmly among the trees. Laughter drifted faintly through the crisp air. 3 years ago, this place had been nothing but silence. Now it was something else. Something alive. Marcus rubbed Titan's head slowly. "You remember the day we found that chest?" he asked softly. Titan's tail tapped the wooden boards. Marcus smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Above them, the mountains stood tall and quiet. The same mountains that had hidden their secret for more than a century. But Marcus knew something now. The silver had never been the real treasure, not even close. And deep down, he suspected Titan already knew that. The first snow of the season came quietly. Marcus Hale woke before dawn, the same way he had every morning for most of his life. But something about the air felt different. The cabin was still warm from the fire he had kept burning through the night. Yet the world outside had gone strangely silent. He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch. The clearing had turned white. A soft blanket of snow covered the ground, the trucks, the equipment near the ridge, and the old shack that still stood beside the newer cabin. Marcus breathed in slowly. Winter had arrived in the Bitterroot Mountains. Titan stepped out beside him. The German shepherd moved more slowly now than he once had. Age had begun to settle into his bones. His once dark muzzle had turned silver with gray fur, and the old injury in his paw made him favor one leg slightly when the cold grew sharp. But his eyes were still bright, still watching, still loyal. Titan walked carefully across the snow-covered porch and sat beside Marcus. Together they looked out across the quiet land. 3 years earlier, Marcus had stood in that same place, feeling like his entire life had collapsed. Now the valley below held something completely different. Smoke rose gently from several small cabins near the tree line where the veterans lived. A pickup truck started near the ridge as one of the workers prepared the day's equipment. The mine itself continued to operate steadily. It never became the massive operation that big companies had tried to convince Marcus to build. He refused. The silver vein provided enough for everyone involved, enough for the workers, enough to maintain the land, enough to give the veterans who arrived there a place to stand again. Marcus believed that was enough. Behind him, the old shack creaked softly as the morning wind brushed against the weathered boards. He turned and looked at it. The little building still leaned slightly to one side. The roof still sagged, but Marcus kept it exactly the way it had been the day Titan scratched at that hidden wall. That shack had changed everything. He walked over slowly and pushed the door open. Inside, the small room looked almost the same as it had the first night he slept there. The wooden floor, the rough table, the old wall where the hidden compartment had once been. Marcus knelt beside that wall. The opening had long since been repaired, but he knew exactly where it had been. He placed his hand against the wood. "Funny," he said quietly. Titan walked into the shack behind him and sat down beside Marcus. "You found the only treasure I never expected." Titan tilted his head slightly. Marcus smiled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the rising sun began touching the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, turning the snow along the ridges into streaks of gold. Marcus stood and stepped back onto the porch. The valley slowly came alive as the other cabins began opening their doors. Men stepped out into the cold morning air, stretching and greeting each other with quiet waves. Marcus recognized each of them. Former soldiers, former firefighters, men who had once carried burdens they didn't know how to put down. Now they worked together. They built things. They laughed. Sometimes they sat quietly, with Titan lying nearby, as if the dog understood exactly what they needed. Marcus leaned against the porch railing. Titan rested beside him again. The dog's breathing was slower now, calmer. Marcus reached down and gently scratched behind Titan's ears. "You remember what I told you that first day?" Marcus said softly. Titan's tail tapped the wood once. Marcus looked out toward the mountains again. "They thought this place was the end of my life." The wind moved gently across the snow-covered clearing. Marcus's voice lowered. "But you found the beginning." Titan lifted his head and looked up at him. Marcus rubbed the dog's neck. The sun continued rising, lighting the valley with warm morning color. The old shack stood quietly beside the new cabin. The mine worked steadily along the ridge. The veterans moved through the clearing, preparing for another day. And the Bitterroot Mountains remained exactly as they had always been. Silent, patient, watching. Marcus took one last deep breath of the cold mountain air. Then he smiled, because the greatest treasure hidden in that forgotten shack had never been the silver beneath the rock. It had been the chance to begin again. And it was Titan who had found it first. Sometimes the greatest treasure in life isn't buried in the ground. Sometimes it walks beside you, with 4 legs, loyal eyes, and a heart that never gives up on you. Marcus thought he had lost everything, but Titan stayed. And that loyalty changed the ending of his story. Now I'd really like to hear from you. If you believe a loyal dog can truly save a person's life, type 1 in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a second chance, type 0. You can also tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, we share powerful stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and the moments that can change a life forever. And trust me, the next story might surprise you even more.